Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events and personalities from around the world. When she signed off on the last episode of the show that bore her name, Hala Gorani told viewers,
"If you had told teenage me that this Arab-American daughter of Syrian parents raised on 3 continents and 3 languages would one day have her own show on this network, I would not have believed you."
But behind that short clip was a lifetime of effort, not least the hard work Gorani had to put into becoming the first Arab American with a show on CNN, but also with her identity, trying to reconcile those pieces of a puzzle that for many years would not fit together. Gorani built a glittering career not only as a celebrated news anchor, but also in the field, covering wars in Iraq and Lebanon, revolution in Egypt, and dramatic elections in the US and France, where she grew up. On the occasions when she would report from her parents' native Syria, she remembers in her memoir, "I was privately searching for clues about myself, for answers to questions that I wasn't yet able to formulate. I was the daughter of Syrian parents from Aleppo, born in the United States, raised mainly in France after a divorce, and based, later in life, in London and Atlanta. I had spent a lifetime trying to feel like I belonged somewhere. Was I Syrian? Was I Arab American? Was I instead French because I had grown up in Paris?" That search for her identity and her memories of a celebrated journalistic career at a time of great significance for the Middle East forms the backdrop of her new book, But You Don't Look Arab and Other Tales of Unbelonging, which she joins me today to discuss. Hala Gorani, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your book. I think I was surprised by how personal it was. And I thought, when I was reading it, I was thinking, is it a strange thing for you that you kind of have to turn the camera around and now you're the focus of it and you have to kind of introspect a little bit?
Yeah, it was. And that's part of the reason that I made it also about my family going back 100 years, about the region. I mean, it starts right at the fall of the Ottoman Empire when my Syrian family that had been for a couple of generations in Istanbul were kind of forced to go back to Aleppo where they originally came from. And so I wanted to make it this long, sweeping kind of a story of displacement, of search for identity, of search for home, because I realized it didn't start with me. It started with several generations ago with a great-great-grandmother who was kidnapped from the Caucasus Mountains and taken forcibly to the Sultan's harem. And I have 2 female ancestors who were both taken and raised in the Sultan's harem, where they were slaves essentially, but at the same time members of the aristocracy. So you had that beginning. That was the beginning of the long journey, and it ends, unfortunately, of course, with the civil war in Syria that led then to the displacement and exile of the remaining Goranis.
Yeah.
And with no return back to. I think that's it. I think this family, already there were very few of Goranis left, and I think those who remained, and until the start of the civil war in 2011, 12, 13, and who then ended up leaving because they're from Aleppo, and Aleppo was really had a very, very vicious front line running through it. I think that those family members will not return.
But do you think that even when you think about this long history that you write about the Ottoman period and then the French Mandate, all of these times, do you not think, is it worse than those periods that you draw the final line with the Goranis in Aleppo?
Well, I think that now it's much easier to leave. It's much easier to establish a life elsewhere, to put down roots elsewhere. And once you have children, in the same way my parents left Syria in the 60s. Right. My dad was in an American university and my mother followed him when they were married 60s, 70s. We were born there. So, that's it. I feel like that presence of at least that side of the family in Syria is gone, but it always remained a part of me in the sense that it was a facet of my identity through the language, through the food, through the culture, through the relations you have within a family that are typically Middle Eastern. So what Syria went through in the last 15, 12, 13 years kind of was a death of a facet of my identity. And that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book too.
Yeah, you say that in the book, that some of it is watching Syria break apart, and your connection to the country breaks apart at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of who I am also disappears. And that's why it was so painful, because I think you only realize how much, this is an old cliche, of course, how much something matters to you when it's taken away.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And my ability to visit, my ability to connect with that part of my identity has been taken away from me. And so therefore, in some ways, I have to reconstitute who I am as a person, rethink myself as a new person born from what has been broken with the Syrian war.
Do you think that maybe because you felt that period had passed, that now you could look back and try to reconstruct it because there's a finality to it?
I think so, and I think it was kind of a love letter to Syria, to a Syria that doesn't exist anymore. It was a love letter to especially the female members of my family, because the male members were often illustrious notables, ministers, and military commanders and the rest of it. But the female members, very rarely photographed, didn't, obviously, because culturally women were not, didn't have careers and didn't have that type of thing. And I wanted to honor them, and I wanted to also document their lives as much as I could, while my mom and her sisters and brother are still here to tell us about that time in history, because they remember the stories told to them by their parents.
And perhaps they wouldn't have seen the end result either.
Yeah.
Which is a way of honoring them, I think,
Of
honoring
course.
their stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
You seem like you feel this close connection to Herniger, the great-grandmother. Great-great-grandmother.
Yeah, yes,
right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Why do you, I mean, you say in the book that you think that you look quite a lot like her.
Well, because she came from, so it was either, so we don't know exactly. So it could be Abkhazia, it could be Georgia, we're not sure. But the reason I look like I could be, oftentimes people will say to me, I thought you were, Polish, or I thought you were Russian, or I thought you were from Georgia, or whatever. And I think to myself, well, I kind of am, even though, in some way, because as I said, I have two female ancestors who come from that part of the world and who were then raised in Istanbul. But I feel a connection to her maybe too, because, hers was a story of displacement on steroids.
Exactly.
This is
complete
just sort of like
displacement,
complete displacement.
Yeah.
And I remember my mother saying, well, she had a reputation of being a little bit, kind of stern and didn't smile much. I'm like, she was kidnapped when she was 7.
Exactly. She never saw her parents again. Exactly. Yeah.
I'd be kind of like, I'd be kind of a little depressed about it, frankly. Let's not judge Herniger too much.
Yeah.
But so, I feel a connection. Maybe there is a connection. Who knows? Maybe we do have a connection with our ancestors. That's not a physical one, but maybe we have an emotional connection through the generations. Who knows?
But you do. I think beyond feeling that you might look like her, it does seem like this story of dislocation that you talk about may be linked in some way to her dislocation, because it was such a big final dislocation. And she never saw her parents again, never went back to wherever she was from.
Yeah, absolutely. And then eventually, this is someone who just ended up, so these young girls were taken from parts of the empire that may not have been Muslim, but they were then converted in the palace of the, and she was an extremely apparently devout Muslim and wanted to go to Mecca and the rest of it, and so. Yeah, maybe, that's not my case in terms of my connection with faith or anything like that, but maybe that was her way to I think some people can use their faith and their belief in a certain structure, of religious structure, to feel connected to something.
Well, you
and that
say
could have been her case.
And you say that in the book. You say that you think she probably would have accepted her fate.
Yeah.
Because she said, well, if God has willed this for me, then this is what I will
Exactly.
do.
And I think this is in some ways, and I don't want to say anything that, I think in some ways this is a way to feel okay with whatever life throws at you.
Absolutely.
And this is not my approach to things, but I can imagine that might have been hers. Yeah.
You can imagine that, in a situation like that, but also at a time like that where there's a lot of things that are happening, sicknesses and the weather and these sorts of things that you have no control over. Now we think we have control over it, but at the time,
losing children at childbirth.
Absolutely.
I mean, how did people go through that? I don't understand.
Constantly,
like constantly, like every third child will die before the age of 5. Now this is considered something you can never overcome. Almost so much grief is attached to that, and I always ask myself, I wonder, how did you deal with that before? Because for all of humanity, apart from the last 100 years,
and only in some places,
and only in some places, it's still the case now in
Yeah.
so much of the world. People just go on.
They
go
go
on
on,
with their lives, don't they? Yeah.
it is really extraordinary, actually, when you think about the suffering that people went through. I mean, I think that's something that does come through in the book, but also I think you handle it nicely because you don't just talk about those stories of your ancestors as something about grief and how awful it was, and also as if you couldn't conceive of what that life felt like. You try to understand what life was like for them, even if it's very different from your own.
I almost try to find myself in them. What was it like to just land in Aleppo after having spent the first few years of your married life and as the wife of a notable, and suddenly have to just live in this city where you don't speak the language? I mean, up until my grandmother's generation, it was Turkish spoken at home. And my mother speaks Turkish. She speaks a very old-fashioned Turkish that kind of today would be very difficult for, I guess, ordinary Turks to understand. But because Turkish was the language of my great-grandparents and grandparents, they were raised in Turkish-speaking households. My mother learned Turkish through her parents, very rudimentary, old-fashioned Turkish. So we're the first generation who don't speak Turkish.
Do you think, I was going to ask you this at the end, but do you think that in 3 generations, somebody, your ancestor your descendant will talk about you like this? And they'll say things like, my great-grandmother, Hala, used to speak English. It was a form of English that no one speaks now.
With her German husband. But I don't know, because I do wonder. That's a good question. I do wonder, will I have descendants in a couple of generations who will find my life story interesting enough to write about? I think there's a certain sense. I think it requires an interest in your ancestry and your family tree that you may or may not have. And I think then it will depend on that person and whether or not they have an interest in looking back in time at their own.
But your life is interesting enough to write about now, let alone in 3 generations. Well, I mean, raised on 3 continents.
But I think what's interesting, for instance, is when I wrote about my ancestor, Hernigar, and my grandmother Berin, it's more. I think everybody's life is interesting fundamentally. Everybody's life is in its period. It tells the story of a time. Yeah. It tells the story of what women went through, what marriages were like, how children were raised. It's a gateway to a time rather than just the naked story of a person as they evolve through. And certainly the story of their life.
Certainly the story of your parents is something that was quite common in that period.
And I hoped that by writing this book, I was telling the story, the wider story really, of people who don't feel at home anywhere and who feel like they are constantly asked to justify their identity, their existence, their fitting in. And it's something that I felt growing up that now I've come completely to terms with. But up until a certain time in my life, it was almost hurtful to always be asked, where are you from? Why do you look like that? What is your name? What religion are you? Do you believe blah, blah? I just wanted to be left alone. I just wanted to fit in. Now I realize how much of a strength it is. But I hoped that I could appeal to those who were still going through a little bit of a, identity crisis, that in the end it all ends up being okay. And also it's not just lofty, identity questions. I talk about there's some ex-boyfriends in there. There's a lot of, going into what it's like being a woman in journalism in the 90s and the 2000s. This was all pre-Me Too. A lot of stuff was acceptable then that is completely unacceptable now, of how women are treated, what assignments they're given, how they are treated if they have PTSD or if they have stress at work versus how men were treated. The collapse, really, of linear TV that we're experiencing, and how that's completely changing our profession, of how everything is now. I mean, look at what we're doing. This didn't exist 10 years ago. Or even, and now we're having to reinvent completely how we tell stories.
Yeah.
And, it used to be that I was an anchor for 23 years on TV. We would have discussions like, should we end the show with this story? And now who cares? Nobody's watching
no
TV
one's watching
like that.
Actual television. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. It's all
like,
clips.
Who cares? It's all clips and the last thing. Now it's like, we'll put the kicker, what we called the kicker, which is the like, oh, look, these ducks crossed the road, and the ha-ha story at the end of the show. Put that at 20 past. Who cares?
What difference does it
make? They're like 10% of our audience is watching this on linear TV. So it's completely different. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to get to some of the stories.
No, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Yeah.
No, because well, let's go back to Paris, because I like this story. So after your mother moved in the mid 1970s to Paris, you divorced, and the two of you moved there. And you write, this feeling of otherness sank its claws right through my clothing and deep into me. Underneath what I wore, I resented my body. I didn't have the genetic skinniness of French girls my age. I didn't have the straight hair, the swagger, the sense of belonging. I didn't have grandparents who lived in some other part of the country or ancestors who'd spoken the same language. You were teased about your foreign name, the clothes. And then, what happened with the anorak?
I had an anorak that my parents had bought me in Algeria, because we lived there for a year or two before we moved to France, and I thought it was hideous. My mother, when I told her the anorak, when she read the anorak, it was cute. It had flowers on it. I'm like, no, it was hideous. And the principal or one of the teachers, I forgot it somewhere, or it fell, I'd forgotten it on a bench somewhere in the playground, and the principal said, whose is this? All the children were assembled before going back into class. And so I didn't claim it because I was too embarrassed. I thought, this is horrible. This just shows that I'm a foreigner and that I don't have the things bourgeois, outfits that the young girls and boys wore in the 70s in this posh Parisian suburb.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was why I found that story interesting, because it isn't just that you felt you didn't look like them. It was something else. This is the point about the swagger and the sense of belonging, something ephemeral.
Absolutely. And there was shame associated with it. And I can't explain why now, because it almost is heartbreaking to me as an adult to think of a 6-year-old going through such a violent and just hurtful experience. But now that I tell this story, so many people tell me that they've experienced the same things. So I realize that perhaps maybe it's more of a universal experience and then also this is how you feel inside. From the outside, people will say, oh, you looked so confident, or you seemed like you fit in so well. So you never know what people are experiencing,
Someone somewhere is telling the story about when they were at school and how they got this anorak for free.
Right.
Nobody claimed it.
I found this, really
wonderful
funky,
anorak,
flowery anorak, took it home, and my parents. No, I feel like that's also a wider story of how what's going on inside is so often different from what people perceive
Do you
on
think
the
that
outside.
Do you think that those experiences are kind of built into the fabric of being an immigrant?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, whether it's Hispanics or people who come from North Africa and France, or even when they're second generation, which I technically am because I was born in the US, they will tell stories of feeling like outsiders. And I mean, by the way, people made fun of my name because in French there's no H, so I became Hala. So you can imagine just how problematic and that would have been. But I went to a retreat in the south of France last year with a friend of mine, and it was a bunch of middle-aged women and me, and they also made fun of my name.
Really?
Yeah, but
Even
in
now?
a funny way, but that I didn't find funny. And my friend kept saying, "Oh, but they were just teasing. Like they were Allah is great, and Allah, that means you're great." And I was like, I don't find that funny.
Yeah.
Why does anybody think that's funny? Of course, now it doesn't hurt my feelings anymore. It just annoys me.
Yeah.
And so I have to kind of, tell them.
That's
To
very
stop.
strange to hear.
Yeah,
Because it's
no,
such
it still happens.
I mean, I even find it strange that people think you don't look Arab, because you look
Do you-
completely Arabic to me.
Oh, really?
Of
Oh,
course.
that's interesting.
I mean,
Because
I-
a lot of Syrians will tell me I wouldn't have guessed you were Syrian, or that you were originally
You don't
Syrian.
think? Do you I wonder. I might interpret that as being an attempt to give you a compliment because there's a feeling that foreigners are, they look different, but there's something positive about that.
I don't think so. Maybe in some cases, but in others, I don't think so. Because, for instance, when I'm in, and I go to the West Bank a lot now, especially since October, I'm working on with NBC News. When I start speaking Arabic, people just look at me just amazed that, what is this American woman? How did you learn how to speak Arabic? And I explain that I learned it as a child because of colorism, and I describe this in my book as well. In the Arab world, there's an association. It's changed now, thank goodness, but with being fair-skinned and being pretty and being more attractive. Now that's changed a lot. But when I was a child, I hope it's changed a lot. But when I was a child and growing up, I would often hear like, "Oh, it's so nice. She kept her fair skin."
Yeah.
And why is that better than having,
I know. It's strange how these things still impact us. I mean, after so many years, people still, in various parts of the world, not merely the Middle East, it happens in Africa.
In India.
In India, it's a big thing, I wondered about the dislocation part, because I think when you are reporting on global affairs, you're necessarily talking to people who have been dislocated by events bigger than themselves. And I wonder if you felt that somehow that initial dislocation that you felt in your private life kind of translates into a certain amount of empathy. Now when you go to places, like Gaza, and people are dislocated.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. It's that's why diversity in newsrooms and diversity among journalists is so important. Having women is so important. You understand, no matter what, no matter how empathetic you are, you're going to naturally understand, be more sympathetic or empathetic with a woman in a refugee camp who's having to go through issues related to being a woman, hormonal pregnancy, whatever. You'll understand that better than a man. If I speak Arabic, I'll understand necessarily. It doesn't mean that someone who doesn't speak Arabic can't cover Arabic-speaking populations, but there's a level of understanding that I will have that will be different. And the two of us together, if we're in the same organization or the same newsroom, will, I think, cover that event in a way that's more complete. And I think that's really important.
So this was the part that I thought was interesting, because obviously the book is about unbelonging, subtitled Unbelonging. I wondered how that unbelonging worked in the public context of your career. Because sometimes you seemed like you were very upset that you were pigeonholed. You talk about this story in the book about Chris Cuomo, an American TV journalist, asking you to explain the difference between Islamist and Islamic. And you say, but you also felt pigeonholed as the international anchor, there to help explain complex foreign developments. But then if a similar story happened like in the US,
right,
they didn't think your expertise. But somehow, that was the thing that I found interesting about it, is that you have this, you are right to say that people can pigeonhole you. At the same time, being pigeonholed does give you the ability to understand a story in the way that perhaps others would, that you just said.
No, I guess, yes, I think that's true, but I think I was wanting to be seen at the time as more than, the Middle East. At the time we were covering terrorist attacks a lot, so it was like the terror expert, and why, if I can cover Lebanese politics, would I not get, of course I would get it, but why then would I not be utilized in the same way to cover a U.S. election, et cetera? And you sometimes got that feeling, but I think that was a little specific to that time and that employer. I mean, I it's not something I feel so much anymore. I think I think it was about finding the right, I have to say this carefully, but finding maybe the right team to work with where there's an understanding that being a good journalist is being a good journalist no matter the story. And I think that's I'm in that place.
Well, there's also something about the perception of impartiality, because if you think about covering an emotional story in New York or in Chicago, and if, for example, you or another journalist were kind of overwhelmed by the moment, and you felt some emotion about what was happening behind you, that would be seen as something that added depth to the story. It gave the audience a feeling of what it's like to be on the ground. If someone like you with your background, were covering the same story in Syria, and you became emotional about it, they would say, well, you lack impartiality. You can't. And that double standard, I think, is something that you went through in your experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's changing. And I think really thankfully that's changing for several reasons. First of all, as a woman, as I mentioned before, in my 20s and 30s, I did my damnedest not to show emotion because I didn't want to be seen as someone who was emotionally fragile. And secondly, that's changed because women now, I think, are very much seen, hopefully, as equals to men when it comes to covering complex international stories and war zones and the rest of it. Secondly, the diversity has increased. So we have a lot more on Western media Arabs and Arab Americans and men and women from the Middle East who are now working at the BBC, at NBC, NPR. I mean, you name it. I mean, I can name 5-6 Arabs who work in Western media outlets. 10 years ago, I would struggle to name one. Yeah. I mean, I was the first Arab American with a primetime show on a big cable network, and I
think you still are.
In that sense. No. There's NBC. There's Ayman Mohyeldin.
Of course,
There are a few others, and then there are also others in very prominent reporting positions as well, which is very important. Just as important. I would argue now probably a little bit even more important because as we were discussing here at the beginning, linear TV is kind of declining in favor of reporting content that ends up being clipped and watched, et cetera. So those two things are changing very much our industry. And so in that sense, I think if I show emotion, and I have in the past, I've actually even once shed a tear on air. And I thought to myself, when I was covering a Syria story, and nobody, in fact, quite the opposite. I was not praised, but there was sympathy directed at me for it because there was an understanding. Yes, I do remember. Yeah. And I'm going to try not to cry, but it was a story it was actually a photo essay of Syrian refugees in black and white, beautifully photographed images of Syrian refugees and the last thing they had taken from their home before fleeing. And so you had a child with a little rickety toy. You had a man with the key to his house, things like this. And as I was reading it, my voice broke, and I thought, this is just absolutely terrible. But anyway, I remember that. But there were other cases where I cried, and sometimes off air, I do definitely still shed a tear up. Even a few days ago, it's happened. And every time I do cry, by the way, I am happy because I say to myself, I am not jaded because there is a risk that you become, and that's when I think you need to move on from this profession. There is a risk that you become emotionless a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think when that happens, you've got to reassess.
I mean, you have to create a certain amount of distance, otherwise it's hard to deal with.
While you're working. But after, when you're done or when you're watching the piece or when you're listening to the interview, you can't break down in tears every time you're reading. But I think when you have time to really take in what you're reporting on, if that doesn't make you emotional, I think that's a problem, to be honest.
Yeah, Arwa Damon, of course, Arwa Damon, she was at an event with us last week, and she said exactly that she wouldn't want to be the kind of person who didn't have emotional responses to some of these things because.
And she's now, I mean, her organization, Inara, is great in that she has used that emotion that she's felt in her reporting to actually do something tangible with it and raise money to treat war wounded children, which is, amazing.
Did you ever feel that was something lacking in your own work, that maybe you didn't see the end of the story because you're moving on to something else?
No, I've never. I know people like, not just her, but there was Shireen, also Tadros, who's moved into activism. For me, I don't feel that frustration. For me, I see my role as shedding light on an event and doing my best, absolutely my best, to accurately tell people what's going on, and to cut through the noise and cut through on all sides, the propaganda. And this is what I'm seeing. I do now, the reporting that I do is very forensic. It's very investigative. I spend weeks, months, sometimes following a single story. And, the fact that I'm not going to see the end of it is, I move on to the next story after that.
Do you still get the same level of excitement about these stories? Because I imagine that, now that, especially with something like Gaza, which is kind of cyclical, every so often there seems to be an upspark in the violence. You have covered, obviously, a few rounds of that violence. Do you ever get the sense that here we are once again, more people dying, we just can't seem to solve this problem?
I do, but with each story, there are differences. There are differences in the intensity. There are differences unfortunately, in how that's affecting the geopolitically, geostrategically, the area, how that conflict is perceived abroad. For instance, Gaza is perceived quite differently this time than it was 10 years ago, because of the scale of the destruction and the death toll, also because of how October 7th was perceived on the Israeli side, and because of, as we mentioned before, social media and how people are consuming the story is quite different. So I do see similarities, but then each time I see differences. And I think, for instance, unfortunately, there is an expectation, or should I use that word? There's an anticipation or fear, a concern that there'll be another Israeli-Hezbollah war, for instance. And this one, I think, will be very different from the one in 2006 because of how much more damage it could wreak, I think, on both sides, unfortunately.
We were talking a bit before about how the narrative is shifting away from legacy publications, with TikTok and short form video, and even, as you were saying, like linear television, the majority of how they are being experienced is they chop them up, put them on social media and so on. Especially when you think about the context of Gaza and Ukraine, a lot of this information is coming from the ground in real time, and then the legacy media is kind of providing context to it. Do you think that has changed? Because a lot of the story now is reacting to something that has already been shown to the public.
Yeah. So you mean, do you think the role of legacy media has changed in that sense?
Yeah, but also that the narrative is shifting, because it used to be the case that the mainstream media, or legacy publications, however you define it, would be the publications that would put out this video. Now the video is out there already.
Yeah, and it's always been when I was anchoring, it was our biggest challenge, because by the time you got to 7 p.m., everybody had heard the news. So I wasn't really going to break the news to you. So it was a question of how do we package it? How do we contextualize it? But it also explains why viewership is down, because people aren't going to tune in at 7 so that I can tell them what happened. They've seen it already on Twitter or whatever, or on X, and their phones and things like that. And that's probably why you're seeing more opinion, too, on cable news, because you have to get viewers to watch somehow, and you're not going to get them to watch by just giving them the rundown of the news without any context or opinion. So you need more opinion, you need more personality, you need more panel discussions, And that's why it's changing the very fabric of media organizations. And then all of that has to be monetized. I mean, these are still businesses.
And they're still trying to work out how to do that.
Because you don't monetize. I mean, when I post one of my pieces on Instagram, I mean, it might get a ton of views, but who's making money off that? Not the media organizations. It's going to be Meta.
Yeah, Meta. Yeah. So at least someone's making money off it.
But not us.
Not us. No,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about we talked a bit about it, but about the family house in Aleppo. You're not the first American correspondent with roots in the region that has tried to kind of talk about the importance of a physical home. I'm thinking about the late New York Times correspondent Anthony Shadid, who tried to...
We miss him every day, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, we do actually. We do.
He would have been fantastic to cover all this stuff. And he's somebody he wrote House of Stone, I think you're mentioning.
That's right, yeah. How do you think Shadid would have responded to what's happening now?
Oh gosh, I wish I could have first of all, his writing and his analysis was always absolutely so beautiful, because he combined... I mean, his writing was a little bit like a bit of a dense poetry. You know, he wrote journalism journalistically, but with the style of a literary writer. And so I think I don't know how he would have responded, but I think his coverage would have been so important, and it would have reached, I think, people who matter, because of course he was with where was he? Because he was with the New York Times, but he was with the Washington Post before, I think, right?
I think so.
So either way, he was always kind of reaching a mass readership with his beautiful language. And I met with him a few times in Beirut, and he was just such a lovely person too, such a lovely human being.
Well, the link with you is that in this book, House of Stone, he was rebuilding an ancestral home in Lebanon, and kind of that gave him a connection with the place. I wondered if, when you talk about the Gorani family house in Aleppo, which is no longer exists, I think.
It doesn't, but it was demolished in the 60s. So it wasn't destroyed because of the war. It was demolished in the 60s because it had this huge footprint, and there were too many, I guess family members who would inherit a small, tiny portion of it. So it was sold and then demolished, and then all these buildings went up in its place. But there was still a little house at the tip of it, a caretaker house that still exists. And it was kind of within, not too far from where the front line was in the old city. So it had some pock marks, and I sent someone to go take photos of it. And so I based my description of it on these photographs that were sent to me from Aleppo last year.
I sometimes felt with the book there's this kind of push-pull dynamic going on with your relationship with the Middle East. Like, on the one hand, you wanted to be accepted by your family as one of them. You didn't want to be called Hala the American.
Right, yes.
But then on the other hand, you wanted to be accepted when you were young in France and to be just an American. Do you think sometimes it would have been easier if you didn't have this particular background?
It would have been easier, but ultimately, yes, it would have been.
The short answer is
yes, it would have been. But it comes back to just kind of maturing into who you are and accepting that you're more than one identity and being happy about it. And I think I've reached that place. It's a happy place.
It's a happy place
yes.
now. I wanted to ask you about the weight of belonging.
Yeah.
One of our colleagues, Mesa, who's a Palestinian-American journalist, and she talked about how, particularly now, there is this weight to being Palestinian and kind of representing Palestine. And it reminded me of that painting, which I'm sure you've seen, by the Palestinian artist Salman Mansour, of the man kind of carrying Jerusalem on his bag. Sometimes I think it's a privilege to bear the weight of being from a particular place. But at the same time, it can sometimes feel like it's a bit of a burden. Did you ever feel something like that during your career? I was thinking particularly about your time reporting on Syria.
Not really. I would say that I feel for people who only have a Syrian passport. I have a U.S. passport because I was born in America. But, every year they have the list of most undesirable
Yeah.
passports in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
Because no one wants to give Syrians a visa. And I have family members who only have Syrian passports who haven't been able to visit their families abroad in Western countries in a long time because they're just not given the visas to cross borders.
Yeah.
So Syria and Sudan, I think.
Syria and Sudan,
Sudan's
yeah,
like
yeah.
just people who have those passports. So I think that's the burden that people have now, that people experience, that this having to carry, quite literally this passport that weighs 100 kilos.
Yeah.
I just whiz through borders. I mean, e-gates,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
as a person with a Syrian, Sudanese, or any kind of passport from a, quote, undesirable country, it's just weeks of going to embassy meetings and having their biometrics taken and proving that they have enough money to support themselves when
Right.
they get to the place, and having a sponsor on the other end. And it's like, and then at the end of all that, they don't get the visa.
Isn't that strange? I mean, if you have a particular passport, like a Western passport, nobody asks you how much money you have.
No.
You can turn up at the border, and they go right in.
Of course.
And then a day later, you have no money left.
Yes.
And you can't live. You end up on the street.
And you have a Syrian passport, and you have definitely enough to support yourself, and you have a family on the other end who's, gainfully employed,
Yeah.
and you have housing there and shelter, and yet you're still denied. So this is what I get to in my book too, which is the complete, just absolute accident of birth nature of how we're treated in this world.
Yeah.
I'm not better than the person who gets stopped at the border. I just happen to be born in Seattle, Washington. And if I had been born somewhere else, I would be, stopped at the border and not allowed to go through. And this is part of why I love being a journalist, because what you're doing, sounds like a cliche, but I don't care, because this is absolutely how I see my role. What you're doing is you are telling the human story of someone who is perceived as being utterly foreign, right? So if you tell the story of the Syrian person in the refugee camp, to me, this is bringing the story of humanity to someone who's in, I don't know where, somewhere, any in the middle of America, USA, who may not have been exposed to that person. But the work that I did gave them that, it created that gateway.
It gave them the ability to see it in a way perhaps they couldn't.
I mean, these people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the difference between them and us?
Yeah.
It's where they were born. It's their passport. That's literally the only difference.
Yeah, the color of the passport.
Yeah.
Your colleague Arwa Damon actually talked about this. She was talking about at an event we did where she said she often felt this profound guilt over, it's a quote, being able to leave simply by virtue of the fact that you were born in one piece of land to a father who was born from one piece of land.
Yeah.
And where you're born dictates so much of what you're permitted to become in life. Mm-hmm. It's not merely where you are allowed to go.
Sure.
But the opportunities that come to you are completely different.
Completely different. And it's so unfair.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess, life is unfair, but it is so unfair because you think how much wasted potential in this earth is there? Really.
You say some of that in the book. You write that I always return to my home with the uncomfortable feeling of having left the people I spoke to behind to face any possible consequences alone. Mm-hmm. This aspect of my job infused me with guilt I carried with me at all times.
Yeah.
You still feel like that?
I do. And it's mainly if when, for instance, we covered the Syrian activists who would, at great risk to themselves, talk to us. Right. But then there was always the possibility that they would be monitored, so I had to really, really make sure that every communication was 100% sealed, that I didn't reveal in any way any identifying details. I was always afraid of that. Of them finding,
sure.
Yeah.
We should end by going back to the question of belonging.
Yeah.
You wrote that this was about your dinner party anecdote, that other people's questions made me loathe my differences because I wanted my identity not to be a topic of discussion over dinner. And yet that was what a lot of the book was about.
Yeah.
I wondered if that was a process of you reclaiming the narrative, reclaiming your agency in talking about these things.
I think in a way it was a way to reclaim the narrative, but mainly I think it was coming from a place of love for the Middle East, of love for my identity. I think it was much more positive than let me get back at those who said this or did this. I think it's also was an exercise in trying to understand what maybe they were trying to ask. That maybe every question I got did not come from a bad place. Maybe I was sensitive, not overly sensitive, but maybe I was sensitive because I hadn't accepted ultimately who I was. So I think it was a love letter to all these different aspects of my identity that include my family in Syria, that include the journey that my parents took, that include now my journey and my establishing myself in one place and married to a German man and living in London but being raised in France. I think all of it is just a way to say, you know what, it's all good. This is the journey that my family took and where I've ended up, and ultimately it's a happy journey. It's one that ends well, and that it's a message I want to send to anybody who maybe still is in the throes of not being too sure where they fit in, if that makes sense.
Where do you feel you belong now?
You know what? Nowhere. No. Actually, that's a good question, because I still don't necessarily feel like I physically belong anywhere. I could pretty much live in any country where I speak the language. I should add where I speak the language, because I'm too old now to go settle in like Portugal or something. I know some people do that, but I know I has to be either French or English. So I would say probably London, because it's been 16 years now total living in London. And I know every corner of the city like the back of my hand, I feel like. And Paris, probably. I mean, those are the two cities. And maybe if in the U.S., it would be Washington, where I was raised as a kid for a few years, and where I still have a big chunk of my family. So those three cities where I feel like I belong.
Have you ever thought about looking for Herniga's family?
You know, I have, but then I looked up Abkhazia, and apparently it is not very safe to go there on my own, or even without it. Apparently, it's virtually impossible to get a visa, and you need to go, but you have to be 100% sure that you have the right escort.
Yeah, I was laughing to myself reading the book, because you make so much about your Syrian identity, and then the civil war happens, and now you're looking into your other identity, and you go, I'm really interested in Abkhazia. They're doing what in Abkhazia?
I know, but the thing is that I'm signing up to all these DNA testing companies. So I signed up to 23andMe, and I have the results there. But I'm going to do Ancestry next, and I'm hoping against hope that some long lost ancestor from Georgia or something will pop up in my family tree, and then maybe we can connect. I'll keep you updated. Maybe Georgia, I definitely want to go. That's for sure. Also, they have some fabulous Georgian restaurants in London. I don't know if you've ever tried them. So good. So I know if I go to Georgia, I'll have a good time. And I read so much about the country that it's got a lot going for it. So I really want to go there for sure. At least it'll be the general area that I need to go in.
Right. I wonder how you would feel. I mean, if you feel that you look a lot like Herniga, then what happens if you go there and you find quite a lot of people who look like you?
Well, it's funny, because when I've gone to these Georgian restaurants in London, the waiters must be wondering why I'm staring at them, kind of looking at their profile. No, that's why I want to go. That might be the next adventure. Maybe I'll write an essay for New Lines about it. How about that?
When I was reading the book, it felt like, even though you've titled it But You Don't Look Arab, it did feel like you were trying to find either a connection to the region or some Arab identity. Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that that's something that you're seeking, or am I wrong in interpreting it as a seeking?
I don't think it's a seeking anymore. I think it's an acceptance that this is a facet of my personality that I genuinely love and that I'm proud of, even though it's weird to say that you're proud of being something that you're born with. I haven't done anything to achieve some Arab status or some, but I just think I'm happy with who I am now, every facet of it, and that I'm not afraid to say that I'm happy being who I am. And that's really very freeing. And I think the book helped a lot in that regard.
Hala Gorani, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. Hala Gorani's memoir, But You Don't Look Arab, and Other Tales of Unbelonging, is available to buy now, online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson, Mikey Andreasen, and Mindy Roscoe, and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.